Welcome to the Book Fair podcast. This podcast is all about the freedom to read and children's literature. This week we have an interview with Stefana Farrell and Reagan Miller from the Florida Freedom to Read Project. The Texas Board of Education may be taking over reviewing books for school libraries, and a senator accuses a local library of perpetuating grooming and pedophilia. Beginning with one of the more upsetting stories from IdahoPress.com, Nampa Library Youth Group rebukes Senator's claims of perpetuating grooming pedophilia. Despite controversy that has spread throughout the community, Nampa's LGBTQ+ Club for Youth's Clutch met Thursday and proceeded with its weekly meeting as usual. Quote, "We did our normal routine. We had a meal, we had some great chili, and we did an awesome yarn craft, and we just hung out." End quote. Director of Operations Mindy Oldenkamp said, "Its members are mostly in their teens with a handful of young adults. Clutch and its mission have been brought into question this past week by Nampa Senator Brian Lenny. Lenny is completing his first term as a Republican senator and recently won re-election for his next term. Originally from California, Lenny has labeled himself as a political refugee and moved to Idaho in 2010, according to his website. After spotting a Clutch flyer on Nampa Public Library's bulletin board, in emails with the library director, Lenny questioned how a flyer promoting Clutch was appropriate for a library bulletin board. Quote, "So your policy means adults can invite kids to talk about sex," Lenny wrote in a November 18th email. Lenny declined an interview with the Idaho Press over the phone and did not respond to emailed questions. The flyer includes the weekly meeting time and locations and states its membership age range of 14 to 20 years old. There are no mentions of sex. Quote, "No pressure, no judgments, just you." End quote. The flyer reads, "Creating an affirming space in our community for LGBTQ+ youth." Lenny has gone on to claim that the flyer promotes a group that is complicit in grooming and pedophilia. His social media posts regarding the flyer have sparked outrage. One of Lenny's posts received 14,000 views as of Friday, and multiple posts have dozens of replies supporting Lenny's position. Quote, "So their policy allows inappropriate sexual perversion towards children, and no one there has the guts to stand up and rip the flyer down to protect children," one ex-user wrote. Quote, "Sounds standard for those freaks, and this is why I do not take my kids to public libraries." Since Lenny's initial November 20th post, the library has received approximately 30 to 40 complaints via phone and email, according to Library Director Claire Connolly. In an interview with the Idaho Press, Connolly said that the flyer does not go against library policy. Quote, "It's merely inviting people to a meeting," Connolly said. "So no, I do not find that inappropriate." End quote. While her staff will take a look at the bulletin boards a few times a week, flyers are not individually vetted by library staff or the board before they are posted. At any time, Connolly said, the library will have dozens of flyers on display. Before this, Connolly cannot recall ever receiving complaints about materials on the bulletin boards. Quote, "It's been quite negative," Connolly said. "It's been accusing the library staff of all kinds of things," end quote. During this difficult week for her staff, Connolly noted that complaints have come in from out of the state as well. Quote, "When people have agendas, a lot of the time it's their own personal agenda," Connolly said. "We just try to do what we believe is right, and we're a great resource for the community." End quote. Following communication with Connolly, Lenny forwarded the email thread to multiple city councilors and leadership. Quote, "I know you've probably all seen this," Lenny wrote in the November 20th email, "but wow, this is the response from our library when child groomers are on the prowl." End quote. Councilmember Natalie Jaglenka, a self-proclaimed staunch conservative, disagreed with Lenny's representation of Clutch, questioning where his accusations came from. Quote, "Where does it say or imply that adults will be talking to kids about sex?" Jaglenka wrote in response. She is in her second term as a city council member and has stated that she does not align herself with LGBTQ+ values. Despite this, Jaglenka said that Lenny's accusations were unfounded and that he was impinging on the group's rights with, quote, made-up information, end quote. Quote, as a constitutional conservative, I will never stand in the way of anyone's rights that I believe God has given them, Jaglenka wrote. The right to peacefully and lawfully assemble, even if I don't agree with it, is something I will defend, end quote. Contrary to all the attention the group has received recently, Oldenkemp has said that the library has taken more flack for it than Clutch has. Quote, I can honestly say we have had very little negative contact, and we've been receiving many positive messages of support, Oldenkemp said. We've received some donations, and so our community really just showed up for us, which we are so grateful for, end quote. In total, as of Friday morning, Clutch has received 4 negative communications and many more positive ones. As for assumptions of pedophilia and grooming taking place, Oldenkemp said that all of Clutch's adult volunteers are vetted with a background check. She also said that Clutch's parents have been very supportive and positive, often dropping their kids off at meetings. Quote, we know exactly what adults are present, she said. Those interested in learning more about Clutch can visit the website at clutchnampa.org. Questions can be submitted through the group's contact form. This next story comes from Austin American Statesman at statesman.com. Texas State Board of Education proposes taking over school library book ratings. Here's why. The State Board of Education has approved a list of legislative suggestions for Texas lawmakers, which includes a proposal to grant the board the power to rate the appropriateness of school library books, and could also render moot parts of a state law that's been embroiled in litigation for more than a year. The proposal would give the elected education board significant power over determining what's appropriate for public school libraries, and would mirror legislation that has been filed by Representative Jared Patterson, who in 2023 authored the Reader Act, a law that placed the burden of rating books on vendors and has been on hold over legislation. A process of rating books that children are reading in schools is best fit for the state board, said the board member Tom Maynard. Quote, this board knows how to vet materials. We can create a transparent process to do this work. This is work that really needs to be done. End quote. The board's proposal aligns with House Bill 183, which Patterson filed ahead of the upcoming legislative session. The bill would let parents of public school children petition the state board to review any book in a school library for age appropriateness or sexually explicit material. If passed, HB 183 would largely rewrite a section of the 2023 Reader Act that has been under litigation since July 2023. Patterson's 2023 Reader Act requires book vendors that sell to school libraries to rate their material for either sexual relevance or sexual explicitness. Book vendors, including Austin's Book People and library associations, sued the state over the law, insisting that it was overly burdensome to businesses. The book vendors also claimed the law imposed speech on the business, since the Texas Education Agency could overrule the ratings the businesses assigned to books. The section of the Reader Act dealing with ratings has been temporarily blocked by an appeals court. Patterson's office didn't reply to an American Statesman request for comment. It is the opinion of the Book Fair podcast that these kinds of laws are done so to take control away from the experts in schools and their libraries, and give final determination to elected officials who may not have the same experience or degrees in library sciences as media specialists. Next up, from Gillette News Record, library board members push for less liberal review sources and more self-published books. Some members of the Campbell County Public Library Board want to change the list of the library's approved secondary source publishers. Right now, the library's collection development policy includes a list of respected journals that are generally acceptable to use as secondary sources. In other words, they are review sources that publish analysis and commentary on research that's already been published. Board member Chelsea Collier introduced the topic at the board's November 25th meeting, asking that the language in the library's policy describing the kinds of approved review sources, as well as the particular journals mentioned, be rewritten to be more vague. Quote, "I think this is a really long list, and I think we need to just strike the language that includes all of these review sources and just make it more broad," Collier said. "A lot of these review sources are very liberal and are not the full scope." End quote. This was part of a larger discussion on the meeting's agenda concerning whether or not to start entering books from self-published or otherwise non-traditional sources into the library's collection, whether or not they are library-bound. Board trustee Sage Bear said she wanted to see the library stock self-published material through Amazon or other channels. Quote, "That printing publishing arena has already changed a lot in the past year to let people self-publish, or there's lots of things on Amazon and different areas," Bear said. "Just because they're not library-bound doesn't mean they can't be in our library," end quote. Circulation Services Manager Elizabeth Albin said buying paper-bound books for the kids section would largely be a waste of money because they tend to fall apart quickly, compared to the hardcovers. Self-published authors, she said, tend to only publish paper-bound copies of their books. Albin brought a handful of paper-bound, paperback, and hardback children's books to the board to illustrate her point. The only paper-bound book in the children's department had been checked out 7 times in 6 years. One hardcover book, which had been at the library for the same length, had been checked out 42 times while sustaining minor wear and tear. Quote, "If you're buying a children's book that is paper-bound, you're going to get a dozen checkouts out of it, and it's going to fall apart," Albin said. "It's a better use of taxpayer money to buy something that's built for libraries versus individual collections." Library Executive Director John Jackson said Collier would have to submit a language addendum and allow a 45-day window to pass while the language was reviewed. The board would vote on whether to accept the change. The discussion was eventually tabled by Board Chair Chuck Butler, who said he needed some time to consider the policy change before moving ahead. Butler told the News Record he hadn't anticipated the board would be discussing content when it came to library materials policy. Quote, "The last time this was presented was the binding issue. I had no idea it had advanced in other people's minds," Butler said. "I always need time to discern and make a conscious decision whether something's good, bad, or indifferent for the library." End quote. Finally, to end on some good news, from publishersweekly.com, Minneapolis concert raises funds for organizations battling book bans. To kick off its holiday season, Lerner Publishing Group mixed up books and music for 200 people on December 5th, hosting its Bands for the Band event at the 7th Street entry at First Avenue in Minneapolis. The concert, organized by the children's publisher, raised funds for 3 organizations: Every Library's Fight for the First anti-censorship campaign, We Are Stronger Than Censorship, and the American Library Association's Unite Against Book Bans initiative. The total amount raised was not finalized by press time. Bands for the Band featured 4 headliner local bands, Dad Bod, Shoots, White Boy Summer, and Yonder, along with non-musical interludes by Patrick Sweeney, the co-founder and digital director of Every Library, and Sam Helmick, the Iowa City Public Librarian and ALA President-elect. The event was conceived by Leo Lerner, LPG Special Sales Associate, whose grandfather, Harry Lerner, founded LPG in 1959. Using people to both donate that night and take broader action to battle book bans in their communities, Sweeney described this as a scary time for librarians who are out there just to help children read, and receiving threats of violence in their emails and bullets in their mail. He noted that the threats of violence extended beyond libraries, and that authors, publishers, and even those with little free library boxes in front of their homes have been threatened. Book bans are escalating, Sweeney added, with 128 bills in 29 states designed to restrict people's access to books and deny them the right to read. Quote, 4,000 books are being banned across the country, he pointed out. If you stacked those books on top of each other, it'd be higher than the Empire State Building. That's how many books are being banned. End quote. Helmick, noting that they played bass guitar in addition to their library work, told the crowd that they wanted to share, quote, two dark truths. Our stories are being erased due to book bans and, quote, our most vulnerable neighbors are being increasingly targeted and censored by this. The second truth is that vital conversations about inclusion and diversity are being weaponized against libraries in order to dismantle publicly funded services that transform thousands of lives every single day. End quote. Describing the ALA's Unite Against Book Bans initiative as a clearinghouse of tools and resources designed to amplify the voices of those who speak up against book bans, Helmick concluded their remarks by declaring that they had three big truths to share. Quote, we can fight censorship together. We have incredible music wherever we go. And together, we're going to win. End quote. Next up, looking at some new releases, beginning with We Are the Beasts by Gigi Griffis. In 1765, 16-year-olds Josephine and Clara eke out a subsistence lifestyle herding sheep in the village of Mende in the Gévaudan region of France. Amid daily harsh realities of disease, starvation, and the threat of male violence, Mende has become the latest in Gévaudan to be attacked by a mysterious and insatiable beast that mainly targets young women and teen girls. As theories develop around the possible supernatural origins of the creature, Josephine and Clara realize they can use the attacks to their advantage, staging brutal deaths to sneak their friends away from their abusive households. But as both the simulated and real death tolls mount, the growing infamy of the beast attracts glory-seeking soldiers, exponentially complicating Josephine and Clara's web of deception. Using a spirited first-person narration peppered with French expressions, Griffis reimagines the historical beast of Gévaudan attacks into a tale of female rage and empowerment after abuse. While the exploration of patriarchy feels underdeveloped, sweet moments of queer romance and affirming female friendships round out this heart-pounding and gruesome historical thriller. This book is recommended for ages 12 and up. Next up, What the Woods Took by Courtney Gould. Two strangers wrest 17-year-old Devin Green from her bed in Portland, Oregon, while her foster parents stand aside. After a 10-hour van trip, Devin learns that she's been enrolled in wilderness therapy and must spend 50 days trekking through the Idaho backcountry with 4 other teenagers to, quote, learn about establishing healthy routines. Though she tentatively befriends fellow Portlander Ollie Baker, Devin is continuously needled by Sheridan West, whose combative attitude slows the group's progress at every turn. When their counselors vanish and the teens find themselves stalked by strange creatures that wear faces from their worst nightmares, the group must rely on one another if they want to make it out of the woods alive. Via close third-person narration that shifts between characters, Gould concocts a harrowing story of trauma and metamorphosis, with a potent mix of real-world therapeutic abuse, supernatural shape-shifting paranoia, and wilderness survival. Depictions of the power of connection and love in the face of hardship ground the otherworldly happenings. The simmering romance between Devin and Sheridan is a standout bright spot. This book is recommended for ages 13 and up. The final new release for this week to look at is When the Stammer Came to Stay by Maggie O'Farrell, illustrated by Daniela Terrazzini. At the start of this personal feeling work from previous collaborators O'Farrell and Terrazzini, disorderly, chatty men lives with measured, tidy sister B in the attic of a home also occupied by their parents and 3 lodgers. Storybook-style ink and watercolor artwork shows B in neat ruffles and Min with trousers and a scraped shin. But everything changes one night during a household game when Min finds that, quote, her tongue seemed to suddenly be locked. Instead, the only sound she could make was s. Similar experiences continue the next day at breakfast, en route to school, and at lunch. Later in the mirror, she sees a smoke-like shape hovering above her, quote, seizing the words as they rose to her lips. B, suggesting that the occurrence is a stammer, identifies the shape as a dibuk, an undescribable spirit that takes up residence with a person, causing them great difficulties. A discussion of symbiosis helps men embrace the dibuk. Quote, try to think of your stammer as a friend. Remember what it gives you. End quote. This book is recommended for ages 5 to 10. Coming up next, an interview with Reagan Miller and Stefana Farrell, volunteers from the Florida Freedom to Read Project. But first, if you appreciate the work being done on the Book Fair podcast, you can help the podcast grow by leaving a review or rating wherever you are listening, or by sharing the podcast with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. You can also follow the podcast on Blue Sky at BookFairPod, or go to patreon.com/thebookfair. Both of these places are where resources are posted for each episode as they are found. Now, on with an interview with the Florida Freedom to Read Project. And I'm sitting here with Reagan Miller and Stefana Farrell with the Florida Freedom to Read Project. How are you two doing today?
Not too bad, considering.
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking.
So, Stefana, would you like to start us off just by giving a brief overview of what the Florida Freedom Project to Read is and what you do with it?
Sure. So we're two parents, volunteers. We take the time to research and through the public records process mostly what is going on in our districts and how across the state of Florida these laws have been implemented in to the detriment of our kids across the state. So we support local groups and local people coming forward and speaking up when they see the freedom to read go under challenge in their area. And the data that we collect through the public records process, both at the district and state level, gets to inform their advocacy. And that's truly what we hope to do, is to make sure that these laws that were passed as transparency laws truly are transparent and that people know how the laws are impacting their kids.
And Reagan, is there anything you'd like to add on to that?
No, it's really just a matter of, how do we support our local families and making sure that they're aware of what's going on, because parents are busy and sometimes, they don't always see what's going in and out of their kids' libraries and school news. And so what we try to do is constantly stay in touch with the districts and inform parents how much curriculum and books are actually being removed from our schools.
And what is the Freedom to Read? How would you describe the Freedom to Read, not as the project, as a volunteer organization, but how would you describe the idea of the Freedom to Read?
So for that, I would say, it really comes down to a student being able to go into a professionally curated library and browse the shelves, knowing what their own interests are, knowing what their reading level is, and being able to choose for themselves what they want to read within the boundaries set by parents, not the state or government officials.
And you mentioned something fascinating there that seems to be misunderstood by the people who are frequently challenging books. You said a professionally curated library. I think something that gets overlooked frequently is the qualifications that are often required to be a librarian for a public school. Are you familiar at all with any of the work that goes into selecting a catalog for a library?
So, as we said, we're parents. That isn't something that we were very familiar with, especially at the start of this. One thing that we did early on was get connected to our we call them media specialists here in the state, to the media specialist organization to make sure that we were aware of what their curation practices were. Many of our school districts actually have those practices in their local policies. And so you can see the criteria that that our media specialists are using when they're selecting books. But it means prioritizing students' needs and interests and making sure that the materials are appropriate for the age group that has access to them. And when you're talking about groups, our grade bands that spans, K through 5, sometimes K through 8, that's a really large variety of needs and interests and reading levels, as well as what content and ideas and topics are going to be relevant to those different age groups. So it is really important. Like we said, we do believe that parents have the right to set individual boundaries for their own children. But when it comes to making sure that every child sees their lives reflected in the books that are available to them, as well as having the opportunity to learn more about the people that are in their communities that may have different perspectives or come from different backgrounds and traditions, it is really important to have somebody with that professional background who can look at the school demographics, who can look at the needs of those children in the school and ensure that every student feels as if the library is curated for them.
Reagan, is there anything you'd like to add on to that?
No, I think just additionally, the media specialists are the ones who are on the ground in touch with our kids, and they know what our kids like to read. And I bring this up frequently. I have one of mine is an avid reader. And if I had to buy him every book that he read, I would be broke by now. Because going into a store and trying to find books that interest him is not the easiest task in the world. But his teachers are able to say, oh, he has a really strong interest in this book. Here are these other 5 authors that he likes. So that, that would apply to classroom libraries. And it's the same thing for this media specialist. And they're able to they used to be able to quickly order books that they could bring into, the library that would develop that love of reading.
Right. And so avid readers really benefit from a robust library. But one thing that's also important is that there are people who are less interested in reading, who may have a more niche topic that they find attractive to them, that they would probably pursue reading if the library had a good enough selection of. And so restricting access to these books is definitely one of the biggest things that can impact the development of someone who is maybe on path to become an avid reader.
No, you're absolutely correct. And Stefana can step in. Her kids are a little younger, but graphic novels are a great example, of a niche that it draws in reluctant readers. And a lot of our graphic novels have been, under challenge. People have said, oh, well, that's not really reading, or that's not this. They've made their own opinions on these, and or the stories, or this picture, says something. They take it well beyond what it should be, and they don't allow those into our media center. So that is, one example of books that are being challenged that might help develop readers and, advance them to the next level where they are reading the books.
Right. And when we talk about something that is maybe not age appropriate, especially when you're looking at an elementary school that has a K through 5, or even those that have like a K through 8, I believe you said grade band was the phrase. Sometimes finding things that are age appropriate for a large range of students can be tricky, but anybody is able to make an objection about certain books, aren't they?
Yeah, in the state of Florida, you do not have to be a parent to submit an objection to material. And so we have had some special interest groups in particular submit large lists of books all at once to our districts and overwhelm them. And these challenges aren't just over sexual content. You have viewpoint-based submissions where they're saying, for instance, and Reagan can speak more fully to this because it's in her district, The Artivist is a picture book that talks about using your creativity, using your talents to speak up and speak out for things that you're passionate about. And that book is under challenge in her district for exactly that reason. It does not have sexual content in it whatsoever. But because anyone can file an objection for almost any reason, we have a lot of that happening in the state of Florida.
Right. And so take, for instance, the book, The Artivist. Somebody makes a claim or an objection to a book based on personal viewpoints. What is the next step? What happens after a claim has been made?
It varies from district to district, but in my particular district, there will be a district-wide committee is convened. Then they have to publicly notice that. So in our district tomorrow night, there will be a committee made up of parents and media specialists. And they review the book, and then they take comments from the public. And the person or people that filed the challenge get 5 minutes to speak and talk about their challenge. And then they vote on whether to retain that book or remove it from everybody. So in this instance, we had a very small group of parents at one school say that they disagreed with this book and they want it removed for every single child in the district.
Right. And when it comes to all of these objections that are made, they typically don't focus on one or two books at a time. I believe Iowa saw about 300 complaints from a single file made by one person. Is there anything like that that's going on in your districts?
Yes. So in Florida, we have 67 school districts that align with our 67 counties. And so our districts are quite large. We also have some districts that are a little smaller. So these special interest groups are using a lot of the same lists that are shared nationwide. And there is a state prescribed objection form now. That wasn't always the case. And many districts are still accepting what they call informal challenges. And so oftentimes you will see these groups try to submit very large lists of books all at once. Other times you'll see one person basically do the bare minimum to fill out the form, and then they'll attach these book reports, and I'm using air quotes so that you can't see it. They use these book reports as their formal way of objecting to specific criteria. And so these have been created by groups like Moms for Liberty and others across the country. And they basically just keyword search and pull out excerpts from the books that they consider inappropriate. And when taken out of context, they definitely look and feel a certain way. We've seen many books, especially in young adult literature, that are available in high schools. Books like Slaughterhouse-Five, The Bluest Eye, Beloved. These books that appear on AP reading lists, they get attacked often because they have either depictions or descriptions of sexual assault and other language. Meant to provoke discussion and meant to tug at what we consider immoral and moral and have those debates. And yet when they're taken out of context in the way that they are presented in these reports, it seems like it's 100% totally inappropriate, especially when you paint the picture of some rosy-cheeked little child having access to these books instead of a young person, young adult that we find at the higher levels in our high schools.
That seems to be one of the biggest tactics that these groups have, is taking books that are typically in advanced reading classes in high schools and making it sound like these are being read to kindergarten classes. And they play at these emotional kind of shock value statements by reading selections and just instilling this false idea of who the target audience is when it's just claimed that they are in schools. But who is the person that ultimately makes the decision? Is it the parents? Is it the community? Or is it typically the school board that is making the final call?
So the Florida Department of Education released a list last month. It was an undercount, but according to them, it was the list of all the books that were removed during the 23-24 school year. And it was about 730 of them. Of those books, more than 80% of those removed, those decisions to remove that the districts reported to the state, were made without a public committee review process. They were made by either individuals within particular schools, usually the principal, or someone at the district level deciding that the book should not be available. So they either received these formal objections, or had a conversation with an objector and then made a decision. Some of the districts also reported their internal reviews. Most of them did not. But there were a few cases where, and these were widely reported on in Escambia County, Collier County, where the books went under an internal review, meaning that they did not wait for an objector. Instead, there was a change in the law, and the districts were concerned that they had books that no longer met the new criteria for what was considered appropriate. And they went ahead and removed any book with any sexual conduct from student access. Collier County at the time said it was going to be just a permanent removal. And that's where you saw books by Ernest Hemingway, Tolstoy, Steinbeck, all of these classic pieces of literature getting removed because they did have descriptions of sexual conduct in them. And then in Escambia County, it was, we're going to pull them. They're guilty until proven innocent. And when we get around to reviewing them, if they fall in line where we think it's appropriate, we'll put them back. But they removed 1,600 of them at the start of last year. And that's where you saw the dictionaries getting pulled and encyclopedias. Those did quickly go back, but they were told by their district, pull anything with any description of sexual conduct. And unfortunately, under that broad definition, dictionaries apply, and that's what they pulled.
Right, and that's the biggest issue, even when there is a formal process, or in this case, when there's an informal removal of these books just done en masse. The criteria is so broad and the descriptions are so vague that it really leaves a lot to the person making the decision to just decide what gets to stay and what doesn't.
Right. And in the state of Florida, they're told to err on the side of caution, which, is interpreted as err on the side of censorship. If you think that there's somebody in your community that could possibly object to this book, spare yourself the trouble and remove it. That's what err on the side of caution unfortunately means. And so no longer are students' needs and interests the priority behind what we're deciding on. We're actually thinking about those very extreme viewpoints that exist in most communities, and whether or not they would come forward and object to a book.
And let's be honest, it's the interests of specifically Moms for Liberty for the most part, isn't it?
It's them and a few other groups. There's definitely a handful of groups that it's their interest for sure. But it really boils down to like sowing distrust in public education. Whether you're making people believe that there's all this, quote, pornography in the schools, or you've got people believing that books are just being removed and nothing's left, you've sown distrust on both sides.
Yeah, the organizations that are pro school choice and pro universal vouchers and defunding public education and dissolving the larger federal Department of Education. They don't care why parents like us that have the means and the ability to invest in private education. They don't care why we get frustrated with our public schools. They just want us frustrated so that we'll take whatever small contribution the state makes through a universal voucher and then go and shop for a private school. It means that they don't have to fund as many kids in our public institutions and ensure that those public schools are working for every single family and every single student. And it really is a terrible movement. And yes, they grabbed onto book banning as soon as they could no longer, really ride hard our districts for requiring masks or not opening during COVID. They moved over to book banning, and it's very possible that they'll move to something else. But the fact of the matter is they managed to change the laws in our state. And those laws have led to chilling effect in our libraries and our classrooms and the discussions that are being had and how our students are supported. And that doesn't go away when they decide to change their narrative. These laws are here and they are impacting our students today, and they will impact our students going forward unless people show up and speak out and say that we need to get back to actually serving every single family and every single community.
So sowing mistrust in public education with these accusations, assigning all of these groups to review books is also just draining funding by having to take up so much time and resources from public education, which is already critically underfunded with underpaid teachers. It's really just putting more and more strain on something that they just want to just liquidate entirely with dissolving the Department of Education federally. And this is an easy lowball question, who is the ultimate victim when you take away federal funding and when you take away reading materials and when you target schools and make them when you make them hostile places for people to be in and speak freely? Who is the victim ultimately going to be, other than the students?
I mean, my answer, of course, was the students. I mean, but long term, it's society. Like the students I'm scared for the state of Florida. If you look at, our investment in public education and where we stand nationally with SAT scores, it's really showing that we're not attracting high quality teachers. We're not attracting discussion in classrooms so that our students, we're not creating the best and the brightest that we can. And what does that mean for the future of our state and, where these kids go to school? Like, these are the kids who are going to be our future military leaders, our future, business leaders. So if you just look at Florida or, I know you're in Texas as an example, what's going to happen? I mean, to our states?
Yeah, I think my answer, there's that story that when Benjamin Franklin was leaving the first congressional convening, I'm not even saying the story right, but the question is posed, what sort of government did you give us? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. And it's important. We need a well-educated populace to preserve and protect our democracy and our republic. And we need to make sure that everyone understands that, the framers of our society expected and wanted to preserve a pluralistic society where we do have the right to disagree and to believe and practice different religions, to have different traditions, to hold on to our individual cultures. And when we're no longer tolerant of that, and when we can no longer there's a lot of talk about indoctrination, and indoctrination happens when you limit ideas to serve a particular narrative, and when you limit discussion to serve a particular narrative, and when you limit information to serve a particular narrative. And that's exactly what the laws that we have recently passed have done. We can't have healthy debate in our classrooms. And if you can't have healthy debate in the classrooms, then children don't learn how to have and hold different ideas and to understand and cooperate with one another. There's a lot of concern about how divided we are as a country now. If we fail to teach our children how to work cooperatively together, we will be more and more and more divided. And so, we're not an organization that says, you want to object to our book, so we're going to go ahead and object to yours. We do not promote that whatsoever. If you want to set individual restrictions for your children, do so if that's what you feel is necessary. But we fully believe that our public schools are there to represent and serve all. And in promoting those different opinions and different beliefs, our children come out ready for a global society. Ready to work and be cooperative and to make our communities better. And so public schools are, if there's a healthy community, there's a healthy public school at the heart of it. And it really is truly important that we understand what this whole movement is, that parents who have their children in public schools are cooperative with both their teachers, their educators, their principals, and their school district leaders. They speak up, they have their concerns, and we're all constantly working to something better, because yes, our public schools can definitely always be better. But that takes cooperation. It does not take these extreme viewpoints coming forward and yelling at one another. We don't move the needle when we do that.
Right. And we need cooperation. But right now we do have extreme groups on one side. What is the way for parents and for the community to get involved to make sure that these extremist groups aren't just taking away the freedom to read? What is the best way for people to get involved in their community?
So if you're if you're in a school district where there are active objections, volunteer to serve on objection committees. It's really important. They do need volunteers that are ready to read these books. And the objection process is important too. It's healthy for a community to come together, read a book in its entirety, and to debate whether or not it's appropriate for a specific group. We don't want to see that go away. We do know it's timely and it can be costly, but so long as there are people objecting to these books, we need to ensure that conversations are happening in our communities. So be a part of that conversation. Show up when there are books ready, going up for review, speak out, write emails, look at your school board policy, make sure that it is, that it has the proper guardrails in place so that one person can't just go from school to school to school and get books removed. And then find and organize, find your people. If you don't feel comfortable, you don't need to speak out at a school board meeting. You can meet one-on-one with your school board members, and you can often have a much more fruitful discussion in that closed session than you can delivering a two-minute heated speech that they can't really respond to. So take the time and make sure that your voice is heard. Show that, if you have your kids in a school, make sure your librarian feels the love too. Let them know that you appreciate what it is that they're doing. This is that time of year where you're thinking about teacher gifts. Make sure that you're not excluding the library. If your child reads a book in the library and absolutely loves it, have them send a note of thanks, write a review of the book. Having children's or teens review the books that they read and submit them to the librarian, that can be really helpful, especially if it's on a topic or a book that is regularly coming under challenge. Those voices are really important for our district leaders and the people that are deciding these books to hear from. And oftentimes they don't hear from them enough.
Any final thoughts, Reagan?
I mean, I was just going to say, in addition to what she said, with parental rights comes responsibility. You need to be involved in your child's education. Volunteer in the schools. Pay attention to your school board elections. Don't just listen to keywords or buzzwords. Like, dig in and ask them, what they stand for. Are they willing to protect your child's right to, a robust curriculum and robust libraries? And do what you can. Look at the forms that are sent home. Like, every single parent has the right to exclude anything that they want from their child's, access. And so pay attention would be my biggest piece of advice.
I would just, one other thing that hasn't come up that I feel is just so important with this narrative that's out there. We're not really banning books. We're just removing what's inappropriate from our school libraries. That's just not true. When you remove a book from a school library, you remove it from the most immediate place of access for all students. And schools, public schools in particular, are all about equal access and for removing barriers to education. And what cannot be taught in a limited classroom time, these students have the opportunity to use the school library to expand their learning. And so when we're removing books from the school library, we are truly denying access. And if a child does not have the support or financial capabilities at home to get access to the public library or to buy books, we are truly depriving them of the ability to really enrich their K through 12 learning. And so if a child goes to a school library and expresses an interest, says I can't enroll, I didn't get into the AP class of my choice, but I really want to prepare and I'm saving up to pay for this test on my own. I would like to read these books that are on the list, and they can't get access to those books in the school library. And even if they have a parent letter saying, please provide them access. So you've got student interest, you've got parent support, and you have a media specialist that knows that, or a librarian that knows it is well within this student's right. They should have access to this literature, but the law says that I can't provide them access as a media specialist. Then you have a law that is prohibiting access to books. And that is, in fact, the definition of a ban.
And lastly, if people want to reach out to the Florida Freedom to Read Project, either to give assistance or with any questions, how can they reach out?
We are on most social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook. We do have our general email address as well, for FL Freedom to Read Project at gmail.com.
All right. Thank you. This has been an interview with Stefana Farrell and Reagan Miller from the Florida Freedom to Read Project. Florida Freedom to Read is a volunteer organization. You can reach out on their website at fftrp.org or follow them on Blue Sky at flfreedomread.bluesky.social. This will conclude another episode of the Book Fair podcast. If you wish to hear more, you can follow the podcast wherever you're listening or at Book Fair Pod on Blue Sky Social. Blue Sky is where I post all resources I come across and any headlines that maybe don't make it into an episode. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.